We're going to get started with CSS. Robbins mentions the CSS Zen Garden website. It had been retired for a while, but now the site has some new changes and updates, and they demonstrate how much can be done with CSS. For each one of these pages at the CSS Zen Garden, the HTML is exactly the same. The only thing that's different is the external CSS file. Really? So how does this work? I'm going to start with a simple HTML document. We have a heading, an image, a few paragraphs, and a list. And how do we get from something like this to something like the CSS Zen Garden examples? So first we're going to make an external CSS file. As Robbins says, this is the preferred method for adding CSS. Now, you can write CSS directly into the HTML page, but that will pretty much defeat one of the big purposes of CSS. One of the big benefits is that you can apply the same style rules to many web pages, all from one CSS document, and give all those pages a consistent look. If the styles are all in one CSS file, it's easy to make changes that then affect all of the HTML pages in the site, even if it's hundreds of pages. So how am I going to make this CSS file? I am going to start a new file, new blank file in my text editor, and I'm just going to start by writing a style rule. I'm going to write one for the body. And you notice that a style rule is enclosed in these curly braces. All right, so you want to make sure everything for one rule goes in between that one set of curly braces. We usually indent like this. So I'm going to change the background of the body, and I'm going to give it a color, which I happen to have over here in Color Picker. So I'm copying the color, and I'm going to make a hash mark and paste, and a declaration has to end with a semicolon. All right, so we don't see any color coding yet. We haven't saved this, but one style rule has one or more selectors and curly braces. All the different declarations that are going to apply to that selector are enclosed in one pair of curly braces. Every declaration ends with a semicolon. So how do I make this a style sheet? I will simply do a save as, and I will put it in my styles folder that I've already got, and I have to save it with a .css file extension. All right, and so now it is saved. And once it's saved as a .css file, then the color coding of my text editor comes in. So I switch to my HTML file. And how does this file know that there's a CSS file associated with it? Well, right now it doesn't know. There's no association at all. So there's a particular HTML element to create this link between the CSS file and the HTML file. And appropriately enough, it's called the link element. So the link element belongs in the head, and it looks like this. It has an href attribute, and it has a new attribute you haven't seen before called rel. Okay, and rel stands for the relationship between the source and the destination for a link tag or some other tags. Some other tags can have a rel attribute as well, but for the link to a style sheet, rel is always style sheet. Has to be lowercase, has to be one word. The href is the path to this style sheet. So remember, it's inside a folder named styles, so I have to type styles / and then the name of it, which we can see at the top, is main.css. So by typing this link tag, and it's one of these empty elements, it does not have a closing tag. By typing this link tag in the head of my document and saving, I will have the HTML document and the CSS file are linked together. When I go over to my page, as soon as I reload, we're going to see that style take effect. So since body applies to the entire page, the background color that I put in has been applied to the whole page. So we begin this work with a finished HTML document. All the structure and the text markup is already complete. We've written all the tags to match the structure of our content. That's step 1. Now we've actually done step 3 already. We attached the style sheet to the HTML document. Step 2 is we need to write the rules for all of our styles. So far we only have one rule, and that rule applies to one selector, body. So now let's add some more declarations to that one rule, the one for body. So I'm going to change the font family. And we'll be talking about this in a later video, but it's an easy thing to see when we change the font. And we'll later discuss why we write 3 instead of 1. And let's set the font size. Okay, and I'll save, and I will reload, and immediately I see that the font has changed. Maybe I think that that is a little bit too small. Maybe I would like to make the font bigger. So I'll come back here. Maybe it's just the paragraph. So I've added 2 additional declarations to the body rule, okay? So let's now make a new rule that applies to paragraphs. And here, let's make the font size, let's say 200%. Let's make it a lot bigger. So I'll save, and I will reload, and we instantly see a huge change, but maybe that's a little bit too much, too big. So let's go back, maybe say, I don't know, 140% maybe. Save, reload, maybe that looks more, reasonable. And how about if we do one more thing to the paragraphs? Let's add a background color of white. White is 3 Fs, and always end the declaration with a semicolon. Save, and reload. Now, here's where you realize that every HTML element, like the P element, has some styles that it inherits from the browser. Look at those spaces separating the paragraphs. We didn't put them there in the CSS, but we could change them. And look at how the list is formatted differently from the paragraphs. When we made the font larger for the P element, it had no effect at all on the UL element, the list. Since Chapter 11 is our introduction to CSS, Robbins covers what she calls 4 big concepts. And you'll learn more about these as we go forward with CSS. But for now, as far as inheritance goes, keep in mind that children inherit from their parents. Parent elements contain child elements. All right, so child elements are inside their parent. So when we put a background color on body, that became the background color of everything on the page. Body is the parent of everything. When we added a background color to P, it affected all the P elements on the page, and it overrode the background color that was produced by body. But that background color for P did not affect the background of the list element, the UL. That's because the P and the UL are siblings. They're side by side or equal. They don't inherit from each other. The second important concept, the cascade, it seems related to inheritance, but actually it's different. It concerns how styles from different sources affect the document. So we saw that the browser's built-in styles for margins above and below a paragraph were not affected when we wrote a new rule for the P element. And we did not change the margins, right? Even though we could have. For sophisticated pages, you will attach more than one external style sheet to the page. And the cascade dictates that the last style sheet attached will override any conflicting styles in the earlier style sheets. You saw a small demonstration of the box model when we put a background color on the P element. We'll talk more about this when you learn about margins and padding in a later video. The box model is very important. Finally, let's talk about grouped selectors. Now, you remember that what we did to the P element did not affect the UL element. So what if we wanted the list to look exactly the same as the paragraphs? You might think that we would have to write a new rule for the UL, but in fact, this is very easy. You can put more than one selector into a rule. So what I've just done is I have added the selector, the element UL, to the same rule that I'd already written for the P, and when I save and I reload, you'll see that it had the expected effect, right? So it's a kind of shorthand. It's very, very useful. So this is known as grouping selectors. Now, let's talk a little bit more about the cascade and how things affect one another. What if I didn't want the UL to be the same as the P, but I didn't change what we've got up there? Let's say I want the background to be a kind of gray color. All right, so save, and so now I've changed the background color of the UL element. All right, so it's a gray. Not beautiful, but we're demonstrating something. Now, if I instead take that new rule I just wrote and I cut it and I paste it up here above the rule that affects both the UL and the P, save, and reload. The same rule that made the UL element gray before now is having absolutely no effect. And why not? Because this one that makes the UL background gray is overridden by the one that comes after it. So this is not a matter of inheriting. This is a matter of the cascade. How does the lower thing affect the upper thing? And the easy rule to remember is the last one always wins. The last one overwrites any conflicting style that came before. That's it for our introduction to CSS. Next, we'll get into more specifics.